Good morning. Everyone enjoying the fall spring we had? Kind of turned cool again. As we get started, Mike, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Father who art in heaven, we thank you for this day and the many blessings you have given us. We thank you for this opportunity we have to gather together this morning and study your word once again. May we take those things that we hear and learn today to heart, apply them as necessary to our lives. Be with us now throughout the rest of this service and throughout the rest of this day. We ask this in all things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Last week, we continued in the institutional question. We had just barely touched on it 2 weeks ago. Last week, we got into it more, discussing how it began, what it is, and some of the problems with it. We had gotten to talking about some of the problems, and if you can see on this slide, it talks about things like environmental justice is a moral issue, or that poverty is a moral issue, economic justice is a moral issue, standing for peace, not warmongering is a moral issue. And I wanted to explore that just a little bit more because I think it's important that we understand what we're talking about when we say something is moral. If we don't get our definitions right, we can think that we're saying the same thing and not be, or we can think that we're arguing when we're really not. So it kind of goes both ways. But what do we mean when we say something is moral? Anybody? Well, this is going.
It's the guidelines that God has set for conduct.
Okay.
But there are things that are temporal that, we have moral, or used to have societal standards. We have moral standards for things that probably aren't necessarily of a spiritual nature. Like obeying laws, for example. The speed limit, it's there for a reason. Is it immoral to break the speed limit? Well, one could say it is.
Well, we're told that we're supposed to obey the laws of the land.
Right. Well, you have an actual spiritual application there of something in a temporal sense. But there are things that are just, moral standards, how you conduct business and such.
What if you don't agree with those moral standards?
That's right. Now, I think one thing is pretty obvious by all these people who are saying this thing is a moral issue. They're using moral the way we often use it, something that is necessary for us to do in expressing ourselves to helping our fellow man. So it means something that's necessary.
Okay. Well, Merriam-Webster, and Merriam-Webster puts up a lot of different things. But first of all, they'll say that it's of or relating to principles of right and wrong behavior, ethical. That's the first one. And then they'll say it expresses a teaching or a concept, like the moral of the story is, or a moral poem. The third one is the one that I like. It's conforming to a standard of right behavior. The fourth one, sanctioned by or operative on one's conscience or ethical judgment. And the fifth one, capable of right and wrong action, like a moral agent. Another slide said that moral values are the things that are held to be right or wrong, desirable or undesirable, and they're often complex definitions, and they're based upon a well-defined value system. And the value system refers to whatever you think is ethical or you choose to follow your life after. And it's a well-defined value system or a moral code. And so let's look at an example, and y'all are going to laugh, but let's look at it. veganism. Okay? Veganism is a moral position that opposes exploiting or otherwise harming non-human animals, and I really like the way that they express that, non-human, because that's what I thought animal was. But anyway, and that also includes hunting, fishing, also includes wearing leather shoes or leather coats. And they say that non-human animals are routinely killed and made to suffer in farms and slaughterhouses. And so in this example, eating meat is a moral issue to someone who holds that standard. It is immoral for them to eat meat or to wear a leather coat or to wear leather shoes. Now, they'll tell you that I'm immoral because I do these things. Am I immoral? Who decides?
God says what,
Not everyone agrees with that.
well, that may be, but you said there was a well-defined standard.
Well, they've got a well-defined standard.
They may, but us as a whole, we look to God for the standards.
Who's us?
Christians,
A small minority.
maybe, but
It always has been.
Always has been.
has been.
You know, that is saying, you know, and I've heard that before, but it's equating, you know, your conscience with morality. You know, whatever your conscience accepts as good must be a moral standard. You know, which I hope everybody in this room recognizes that's not the standard.
As a Christian,
Offered to idols, though. What one considers okay, another is their conscience is violated. That's the way I look at this veganism thing. You know,
yes, sir.
They're trying to sell a bill of goods to the general public. The general public,
Amen.
all of us believe the word moral means something that's necessary, something that's good and not bad, and we ought to do that. And as all those pictures up there, you know, we're trying to get each of their things, not just out of their moral standard, but into the general moral standard for people, etc. All of us agree the word moral means that's a good thing and we ought to do it. Now the question is, how many things are in that particular area? We believe only God. God allowed sacrifices of animals, allowed animals to be eaten. Jesus obviously ate two animals. And according to our standard, killing animals and eating them daily or slaughtering them is not contrary to the law of God or our standard.
Right. As a Christian, I choose to let God decide what my moral standard is. The standard of right and wrong that I have to follow. And I made this choice when I accepted Him, accepted His offer, and accepted His conditions for salvation. I said, I'm going to follow God as my moral standard. Now, is veganism in that moral standard? Not. And yet, some people in the world will call me immoral because of it.
Brother Scott?
Yes,
Now,
sir.
it might have been before the flood. We argue about that. It might have been before the flood, but it wasn't after the flood.
Correct. God said He gave them everything to eat. So, when I'm following His standard, oh, excuse me.
There's so many people out there that they don't have the morals because they weren't raised that way. I don't know if everybody knows that here, but I'm speaking as a teacher because when I talk, I mean, I will speak about God in my classroom, and I always say someone's watching over you, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I know I may get in trouble for that someday, but I really, it doesn't bother me. But it makes me nervous to say this, but if I say something to them or ask them, they have no idea.
Right.
And I just think there's so many people out there, and their children are being raised today, they don't know what the Bible is, they don't know what church is, they don't know a story in the Bible that, you know, even the beginning, you know, who made Adam and Eve. I think that may have come up in my class one day, and it's just, it's awful. Just
Yes.
to think about so many of them out there that just don't even know, you know, where to start in that realm.
And so many of them are raised without any standard, and they would be considered amoral. That's not a word I've used so far, but they are amoral. They don't have any standards. And so it becomes a standard of what feels good to me is my standard. Yes, sir.
And in the Old Testament, animal flesh could be eaten, but the blood of the animal could not.
Right. So, now, whenever I follow God's standard, I'm moral. And that means, or I'm righteous. I don't know if people have equated those two words together or not. And if I'm wrong, tell me. But if I'm moral, I'm righteous.
Amen.
And if I'm not following his standard, I'm immoral or I'm sinning. I'm missing the mark of what he wants. So, anyone have any other comments or questions on this little section? Because I thought it was important that we clarify what we're talking about.
Sometimes we say that man is a moral being.
Yes.
I mean, he's capable of making moral choices and understanding moral differences. It doesn't mean that he is practicing the kind of morality he ought to, though.
And some of us will believe that there is an implanted sense of morality because and I'll base that on the fact that Paul told them that even the Gentiles followed this, God's law, even though it wasn't given to them directly, that they were accountable because of that. So, these are some quotes that I also found discussing this, and it's interesting, and it says, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other, and this was John Adams. Y'all agree with that?
I agree with it, because I think what we saw in 2020, like those so-called marches or protests, those people were rioting, they were looting, but yet others said that, oh, well, that morally is okay,
Mm-hmm.
because they were bringing attention to a societal ill.
And they're using that word moral again in a way that we don't agree with.
Well, I don't think the Bible agrees with it, and I think there again, the Constitution, what he said, that's a perfect example. They threw away the Constitution.
Yes, yes, sir.
In the Declaration of Independence about, our being just and making war with Great Britain, etc., for our independence. At the closing part of it, it talks about the good people of these colonies. That's the whole question. Was our rebellion, was our revolution good or not? Well, if we're good people and the British were bad in this matter, then we were justified in doing so. And it's along that line that also they're justifying the Constitution for a people who are a good people who have rebelled against England, now have their own separate nation, and they need something to tell them what the government can do and what it can't do.
Right. And this next one says, when morals decline and good men do nothing, evil flourishes. Now, it's interesting this was said by J. Edgar Hoover, who was a man who was of questionable moral, but nonetheless, the statement is good. So I thought that one was kind of funny. This last one, morality is important, or more important than laws, because law depends on morality. What about that statement? I don't know if y'all ever remember seeing it, but a few years ago there were statements made on commercials like, it's not only wrong to buy cigarettes for teenagers, it's against the law. They were putting the law above morality, and that is backwards. Yes, sir?
The question is, what is meant by law here? Is it divine law or human law? Now, of course, if it's human law, then the basic morality, which is God's law, is greater than that. But if morality is based upon God's law, then it's about the same.
Well, I think that our morality should be based on God's law, and then that justifies us for not following man-made laws when they conflict with God. And that's what Peter said. He said, who are we going to listen to, God or men?
But speaking specifically of the United States, our founding fathers but that depended upon what we call libertarianism, which is personal responsibility. That I am going to live my life, I am going to follow the laws that are established, but more than that, I'm going to be personally responsible, and I will not infringe upon the rights of others. In order for that system of laws, for that Constitution to work, that's what he's referring to. You had to have moral people who said, I'm not going to infringe upon this other person's rights. I'm not going to do anything that would keep them from the pursuit of life, pursuit of happiness, or take away their life or their liberty.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, finally we came around and realized slavery was wrong, because if all men are created equal, then we've got to treat everybody the same, and we can't hold another person as property. Now, slavery had existed since practically the dawn of creation.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, we recognized here that if we're going to hold true to the Constitution, we have to abolish that.
Yes. I agree with that. Anyone else? Okay. Well, and that back to the problems with the social gospel. We kind of rode that horse far enough. So the social gospel, even though the churches of Christ didn't reject the Bible as the inspired word of God, they kind of changed their focus on what it said, and they started thinking of some other things that we should do, and that's basically how they began to get involved with things like colleges and building of orphan homes. And they said, well, the things that were in denominations leaked over into the church as they usually do. So this was a problem. Now, prior to World War I, they mostly talked about colleges. And even though the colleges said they didn't do it, they did lobby churches for money, and churches gave it to them. These denials were not true, or not always true. But people didn't want to interfere with church autonomy. In the 30s, some people began promoting it publicly and heavily. G.C. Brewer is the one who basically brought it out. He began advancing the theory that Abilene Christian College needed church support because they were teaching Christians and teaching people to preach. And this was supported by the Gospel Advocate. Other people like Foy E. Wallace and W.W. Otney were opposed. Yes, sir.
The Gospel Advocate wasn't in favor of that.
Oh, it wasn't?
No.
I may have gotten the wrong picture then.
Now, he could write for the Gospel
Ah.
Advocate, but the Gospel Advocate was not in favor of that.
Okay.
In fact, Foy Wallace, in the early 30s, had been editor of the Gospel Advocate.
Okay. Well, I'm mistaken. I'm sorry.
But they came to be in favor of it.
Well, yes, but way down into the 50s by that time.
Yes.
Yeah, it used to be the Gospel Advocate had this policy. They were willing to publish both sides of any discussion in the Brotherhood. But later, the guy in Woods, they dropped that because, as Woods said, it's not our obligation to feed people poison just to give them an antidote afterward.
Okay. Interesting. World War II came, and basically it took a back seat for a while because people were talking about, is it okay to send our people to war? Is it all right for Christians to fight? And we're not going to get into that today. That's another issue that I don't want to get into. But anyway, this kind of postponed it, but didn't prevent it. And so after World War II, there were a lot of things that allowed for it to come back. And one of those was those leaders who had been leading the fight were no longer fighting. They weren't there anymore. They had died. Other people who had newer ideas, more progressive ideas, came to the forefront. Also, after the Depression and after the war, there was all of a sudden a lot of money coming in through the GI Bill for people to go to college. Not a bad thing, but these church schools needed money to upgrade their facilities so that they could handle all that. Where are they going to go for it? Well, they're going to ask the churches. And then finally, after the war in Europe, Europe was devastated. There were a lot of orphans. There were a lot of needs. There were a lot of things that were needed over there, and churches began to think, how can we take care of this? And, they figured out different ways of congregational cooperation, and that actually is going to be our next lesson after we finish this one. So I don't want to get in that too much. But the most notable of these was the sponsoring church, where they pooled resources. The best known of these efforts was the Herald of Truth. Anyone remember the Herald of Truth? I can remember hearing it in the mornings at the radio at breakfast. It's interesting, this slide, in the circled part.
Scott?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was a teenager then, I think. But I thought, like so many of us did, preaching the gospel in a nationwide, nationwide radio situation is a good thing. We weren't thinking about how to do it. Those two guys, like Nichols and the other going around, they knew how they were going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
They just made us get all stirred up about what was a good thing, preaching the gospel in the whole nation. Because by that time, so much of our preaching was just in the church building.
Yes.
We weren't going out into parks to preach and do things like what we used to do. And I thought, boy, that's a good thing.
It's a good idea.
And the same thing is true with helping orphans. We think, well, that's a good thing, and it is a good thing. But when we start talking about the ways and means, we say, we've been doing, like Clinton Hamilton, who was dean of Florida College. Clinton Hamilton said, we preached it right, but we practiced it wrong.
Yeah. Well, this is an ad, for the Herald of Truth. It explains their vision and their strategy. And it's interesting, the part that's circled in red, if you can't read that, it says doing what the local church can't. Okay? That's an important line. What the local church can't do. Okay?
Also now, brethren at that time were so opposed to the missionary society, a separate organization.
Mm-hmm.
So brethren would take one local church and blow it up to be a huge sponsoring church, which was no longer what a local church was. It was a virtual, institution too within itself.
Yes.
But they said, no, it's just the church doing it. The church is doing the work of the church. You shouldn't object to that.
Like I said, that's the next lesson that we'll get into a little bit more. But you're right. The issue of church support for institutions came up again, and people said, well, after the war, we've got a real opportunity. And it was no longer a hypothetical question, but we can't have people saying that there's strict independence and separation, because that just won't work. And so they took the lessons that they had learned, and they said, well, asking for support for colleges really didn't work out that well. Let's try a different tact. Let's talk about orphans. Anyone look at that picture and not feel a responsibility to help? Well, they knew that. They knew how to pluck your heartstrings. They knew how to make you give money. They've got all kinds of people all over, I don't remember the street, but where all the ad agencies are that learn how to get your money. N.B. Hardeman, he said, I have always believed that a church has the right to contribute to a school or orphanage if so desired. The same principle that permits one must also permit the other. They must stand or fall together. And that was basically the statement of the institution, or what became the mainline position. So, He said it's right to contribute to the church-supported college, and as we said, after World War II, it shifted to it's right to support the orphans' homes, but if you start supporting the orphan homes, you really can't talk about anybody who's supporting the college. So, talking about the starving orphans, it was actually, a very good ad campaign.
Appeal to the emotions of people.
Yep, and if you didn't do it, you were an orphan hater. Anyone want to be called an orphan hater? Anyone want to be told they drown cats or something? Yes, sir?
Also, the way to get this kind of thing in, what they said was to start with, that this is just one way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
This is our way of doing it, and it's a scriptural way, a good way. Now, you may not agree with it. You do things your way, and we'll do things our way, and we'll have peace and we won't have division. But before very long, if you're an anti, you're sinning, and you're going to hell, and so we got to oppose antis with all the force we can, so that we get all this wealth of churches coming in and functioning the way we want them to.
Yes. And
But first it was, as I said, okay, well, we think this is the right way to do it. We all agree the work should be done. Okay, This is the right way to do it, and so let us do it our way, and you can do it your way, and we'll be all unified together.
yes, that's what they did.
Change.
But some well-known preachers who were tied to the colleges started condemning people who disagreed. And they accused people of coercion and intimidation and things like that. Those with an outside business, particularly if you were non-institutional, you might see that your business was facing a boycott. Yes, sir.
And gospel preachers who were conservative on this matter, who held many meetings, especially in the summertime, those guys would go around and do everything they could to get those churches to cancel their meetings, like Homer Haley, for example.
Yes, sir.
There were a lot of, like Franklin Puckett, et cetera, too. These guys were popular preachers, they held meetings, but they were conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
And to squash them and squash their influence with local churches, these guys went around and got those churches to cancel as many as they could the meetings of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and even if that had been a good thing to take care of orphans, which, we're told in the Bible that, we're to care for orphans and widows. But just say an orphan's home had been an okay thing for the church to do. They changed that from just taking care of orphans, then to having children there who weren't true orphans,
Mm-hmm.
and then charging people who wanted to adopt the true orphans. You couldn't get them out of one of those homes. My parents tried in the 60s
Mm-hmm.
to adopt a child out of one of those homes. You couldn't get a child out there.
It become a business, hadn't it?
Yes.
But you just hit the point. It becomes a business, it's a human institution.
Mm-hmm.
And the Herald of Truth itself, I don't know how long ago it was, but my brother out there in West Texas, who used to preach at a congregation where I attended, he said they examined the financial statement of the Herald of Truth. And they were taking in, I think, for example, $8 million. And 70% of that went for staff and administrative. Only 30% actually went directly to, their media.
Mm-hmm.
It's a business.
It was very much a business.
It's an institution. And let's just get a little closer to home, right up there in Paragould, that children's home. Try to get them to give you a financial statement. Why do they have an estate planning program to get Christians to, do charitable remainder trust and things? Which that's fine if you want to do that as an individual,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a business. As she said, their whole thing is get the children in there. It doesn't matter if they're children of Christians or not, because we gotta get that state funded.
That's what it devolves into.
I'd say this, Brother James Cope was one of the ones, younger guys, who really opposed this with tooth and nail, and of course, got a lot of enemies in the process. But at Florida, in fact, Florida College almost, went broke, because one of the head guys on the board was in favor of doing these things. And then when, Cope wouldn't go along with what they wanted, and Florida College accepting, contributions, et cetera. He got out and did everything he could to destroy Florida College.
Yeah.
Of course, BC Goodpasture did too.
We're going,
But the point was that Florida College, encouraged brethren who agreed with them individually to support the school. But my wife worked in the business office many years, and if she ever got a check that even sounded like it came from a church, she would send it back and tell them that we did not accept contributions from churches, only individuals. And often she'd get a letter back saying, oh no, we just misspoke ourselves. It's really just a bunch of us who are members of this congregation who are giving this money. But now these other places, way back in the 30s, and even 20s for that matter, if they got, in most cases, if they got a check, they would just, use it. But they didn't advocate, the brethren supporting, local churches supporting colleges. But Cope especially, and so many students who went there went out and were conservatives too. But if they had meetings, they'd have to get their meetings canceled too by these guys.
yep. And you mentioned BC Goodpasture. In the Gospel Advocate, he called for what he said was a yellow tag of quarantined to be imposed on any who espoused a non-institutional position. And we're not really familiar with what a yellow tag of quarantine is. But back in the early 1900s, if whooping cough broke out, they'd put a tag on your house and say you can't go in there, unless it's you. But other children, other people can't visit. They've got to stay out. Other signs that you might see would say, quarantine. No one shall enter or leave this area without written permission. And Goodpasture recommended expelling non-institutional members from local congregations.
And they were the ones who accused the antis of, backbiting and all this kind of thing, but they themselves were the ones who were loving and spiritual and so and so.
That's what they told you. So, but they were the ones who said, if you're not in favor of this, we're going to kick you out of the church. And so it turned from trying to persuade people, it turned to more militant, we're going to isolate them, we're going to get rid of them. And on one side you had G.C. Brewer, N.B. Hardeman, Robert M. Alexander, and B.C. Goodpasture, and on the other side you had Foy Wallace, Roy Cogdill, Fanning Yater Tant. And in the next decade, there was a bitter argument going on. And even though they might have debated about it, no one really changed their sides about it. They were all pretty much convinced.
I want to tell us all what Brother Ed Harrell said. He was very close to the Goodpasture family, and the Goodpasture family might have even helped him go to college. I'm not sure about that. He said, but he was in Goodpasture's office one time. He did not contradict Goodpasture, but Goodpasture said to all the ones present, I am going to destroy Florida College.
Yeah. And we look at statements like that today and we say, that's a statement just full of hatred. And that's not what a Christian's supposed to be.
Well, that's immoral.
Well, I agree with you.
I mean, God,
God hates someone who causes division among the brethren.
but that attitude just so closely ties with our next lesson on church cooperation, because they are totally disregarding God's design for the church
Mm-hmm.
and the church's mission. support of these man-made institutions. And why? Is the college more important than the Word of God and the upholding the concept of autonomy of a congregation?
They might think so.
You know, Guy in Woods, back in the 40s, wrote a few of the Gospel Advocate annual lesson commentaries. And in there, he indicated that a major problem facing the church was the church getting wrecked on the rock of institutionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in debate, he got all those quotes coming back to him. And he said he didn't mean what you're saying. Well, what did you mean then? He never could explain. He said, I've never changed my mind about that. Well,
Yeah.
obviously, he had changed his mind. And like so many, once there were liberals pushing this matter, they jumped on the liberal bandwagon and often denied that they had changed at all.
Mm-hmm. In this time, preachers who were at odds with this movement were ordered to publicly refute it as a condition of employment. You know, you don't agree with this, you don't say so, you can't preach here. And so at one point, the Gospel Advocate became a forum for these people saying, I've changed my mind. And some churches were forced to make token donations to the institution. You know, they might send $25 a month. They might send 10, but they were supporting it, so we're not the antis. You know, and sometimes there were physical altercations because of it. People who believed the opposite side, they kicked them out, and they had lawsuits over who owned the building. And the people who were kicked out often formed another congregation. And, you know, a lot of places where you see two churches of Christ in a little community, this is why. If you've ever wondered about it, why in a town of, 1,000 are there two churches of Christ? Well, because they couldn't get along. Or a town of 200. You know, this is why, and this is where the anti come from. Yes, sir.
And Brother Willis tells us that at least 80% of the churches went with the liberals.
Yes.
Because they really knew how to put pressure on churches to make them line up or else.
Yes.
Fear, like Peter, one time he stopped eating with the Gentiles in Antioch, but he was afraid of the Jews who had just come from Jerusalem, etc., and he played the hypocrite.
Mm-hmm.
So if the Apostle Peter temporarily, through fear, could do a thing like that, how much more just people like us?
Peer pressure can be a terrible thing.
But I would also say this, personal example. I grew up in what we would term a liberal congregation. And all I ever heard about was that little anti-congregation. Because I remember when I was young, driving there on that highway and seeing that Melton Avenue Church of Christ sign and asking my parents, why is there another congregation here? Oh, they're anti.
Mm-hmm.
They're anti. And I was like, oh, that's got to be bad. And then you grow up and you get exposed to what is the true side of things. And that's the problem I see today. You've got 80% of those who call themselves Christians, members of churches of Christ, growing up in liberal congregations that never see teaching like this.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know of what happened in the 30s up to the 50s. And once I started studying that, and you have people say, oh, well, it's a good work. It's a good work.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we should do it rather than basing it on the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the children growing up in those congregations now are just told it's all about the money. It's just all about money, how we spend our money.
Yeah.
They don't say what is wrong with how we spend our money.
Well, by the end of the 60s, they had pretty much split. There was what they called mainstream, and then there was The non-institutional are what we would call conservative, and they didn't have any contact with each other, and that still continues. You know, there are people that don't send us their announcements for their gospel meeting, and we don't send them ours. Yes, sir?
But whenever they, along with the Christian church too, maybe, I don't know if the Christian church is, I don't think it's, I guess sometimes they have national meetings of anybody who professes to be somewhat in the restoration movement. And all of us tend to go to that and argue with one another during that time, but then it's over. One time I gave a lecture in 1990 in Dallas over that particular matter about the proper way to interpret the Bible. But we don't like what they say, and they don't like what we say. Of course, as Brother Jim says, I mean, as a teenager, I was a liberal too.
Yeah.
But I finally figured this out. In fact, I even debated in debate club a brother who was an anti, so to speak. And I think I did. I think I really gave him. I mean, but I looked at everything the Bible said, and I said, "Now listen. Am I able to make arguments based on the Bible that a person, if he's honest, would have to say, yes, that's what the Bible teaches?" And I said, "No, I can't. I might get close to it, but I can't really show that is what the Bible teaches. So I can't teach that anymore, and I've got to oppose those who say that the Bible teaches that, and everybody has to be able to see that."
Okay. Well, by the late 60s and early 70s, they had split. It was complete. The people who had been kicked out and had to start over, basically, they all believed the same thing. But in the institutional churches, the mainstream, they had their own problems. They had their own liberal and conservative. And if you ask them, they'll talk about the liberals that they have to deal with, and they think they're right on the money. They don't understand, and they don't really know about us. They don't talk about us. They don't know the differences. And they don't know the history. As you said, it was just about the money. So, should we take care of orphans? Obviously. Should we support Christian colleges? Depends on who we mean by we.
Individual or congregation?
Individuals, yes. Are we responsible for non-benevolent care of non-Christians? Huh?
Not as a church,
Not as a church.
individual.
Yeah. When you look at what Paul said in Galatians, he said, "Let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." So then as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially of those who are of the household of faith. I don't want to make this sound sarcastic, but if we take care of everyone of the household of faith, we ain't going to have anything left to take care of other people. But God has placed the responsibility on the church, or has God placed the responsibility of the church for relieving the physical needs of non-Christians, and what is your evidence? Has he? I disagree with you there. For some.
Well, for some, yes.
Yeah.
They've taken that into that moral issue and so provided soup kitchens and clothes closets and all kinds of things, that to help the physical needs of non-Christians.
And we have to be able to prove it by book and chapter and verse. If we don't have the authority, we can't do it. And that was the second bell, so we're going to pick up close to here next time.